So my name is Lenny Enzel. I am a retired Army nurse, and I'm happy to be your moderator for these webinars. This is our 14th webinar in a continuing series of linking Army Nurse Corps officers, past and present, in concert with our mission to preserve the past, capitalize on the present, and embrace the future. It's my honor and privilege and pleasure to introduce our speaker. We've all been so excited that we were able to coordinate to have her speak with us today. I know some of you have seen her speak at Arlington Cemetery, and she just wowed you. And people said we just have to have her as our speaker. So her name is Dr. Allison Finkelstein. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Maryland, where she studied historic preservation and of course history. She currently serves as a historian for the United States Army. She previously worked as a historian for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services History Office and Library, and as a historical consultant at both the American Battle Monuments Commission and the United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration Office. As a public historian, her projects have included the creation of museum exhibits, publications, interpretive programs, educational programs, documentary films, webinars, tours, and narration for military processions. Her books and articles have won awards, and she frequently presents at scholarly conferences and gives lectures to a variety of audiences. She's been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the CBS News, Fox 5 Washington, D.C., and C-SPAN 3. So as you can see, she's quite accomplished, and we're really lucky that she was able to make this time to meet with us. So I am going to turn it over to Allison. Remember to use the Q&A for your questions, and when Allison's done with her presentation, we'll have her address your questions. So thank you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Lenny, for that beautiful introduction. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me as your speaker tonight. It really is an honor to be able to be hosted by the Army Nurse Corps Association for a public program discussing the history of the military nurses who preceded the Corps' creation. I want to especially thank Donna Smalley for linking me up for this program, Lenny, Karen Gaussman, CJ Moore, Nikki McCasland, and the rest of the team at the association for their hard work in making this webinar possible. And on a personal level, I'm especially excited to be able to give back to the Army Nurse Corps community because I am an Army brat born at an Army hospital. Army nurses helped to bring me into the world. So thank you, Army nurses. I serve as senior historian at Army National Military Cemeteries, where most of my work focuses on Arlington National Cemetery. So I'm going to go ahead and put my slides on now and get on into my introduction. At Arlington National Cemetery, I'm part of a small team of historians and curators whose mission it is to tell the story of those buried at Arlington, as well as people who have helped to uphold our mission over the last 160 years. Virtual events like this one are an important part of our work. They provide a method for sharing the cemetery's history with our stakeholders across the nation. We are really glad to be able to do this webinar in 2024, which is actually the 160th anniversary of the cemetery's creation, a milestone we are recognizing with a variety of events I will share with you all later. In my brief remarks this evening, I will be giving you a virtual tour of sites at the cemetery associated with women who served as contract nurses during the Spanish-American War of 1898. And if any of you were at our November 10th event on site at Arlington National Cemetery with the association, some of this will seem a little bit familiar to you. But for those of you who weren't, today, from the warm comfort of your homes, you will have the opportunity to virtually explore the graves and memorials that tell the story of these pioneering women at Arlington. While I admit it's certainly not as good as being on site, I hope this virtual tour will teach you about the women we're talking about tonight and hopefully inspire you to come visit in person. Here on the screen, you can see a map of our virtual tour stops tonight. I have highlighted with red arrows the main stops we will be focusing on. The contract nurses who worked for the Army during the Spanish-American War hold great significance for both the Army Nurse Corps Association and Arlington National Cemetery. As you will learn, these women laid the groundwork for the creation of the Army Nurse Corps, and they opened up opportunities for subsequent generations of military nurses and military women overall. For the cemetery, this generation of women pushed the boundaries of women's presence on the cemetery landscape, both in terms of memorials and burial eligibility. And I really hope that through our virtual exploration, you will come away with an appreciation for how revolutionary the service of these Spanish-American War nurses was. It was revolutionary for women, for nurses, and for the military. Despite serving as contracted civilians unable to actually join the military, they voluntarily put themselves in harm's way to support their nation. They proved, without a doubt, that women could function as military nurses and should be given the opportunity to do so as part of the armed forces. They are really the foremothers of the Army Nurse Corps, and too often they are overlooked because they were not technically part of the military or even official veterans. Together, I hope we can honor these women as the veterans that they truly were, and recognize the important place they had in the trajectory of military nursing and the history of America's female service members. With that introduction done, let's go ahead and get started and head to our virtual stop, the grave of Anna Caroline Maxwell, located in Section 21. Commonly referred to as the nurses section, most of our stops tonight will be in Section 21. As I'm sure most of you already know, women have long worked as military nurses, tending to soldiers on battlefields and in hospitals. For much of the 18th and 19th century in the United States, female nurses did so informally, often as ad hoc civilian volunteers. Most well known, of course, was the famous Civil War nurse Clara Barton, called the Angel of the Battlefield for her bravery. After the Civil War, in 1881, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross, a milestone which helped improve the organization of nursing in the United States. Overall, nursing became much more formalized at the turn of the 20th century, and new opportunities were created for women to secure training as nurses. Nursing soon became one of just a handful of professional occupations open to women. Women could become a nurse by attending a training school, often located at hospitals, where they learned specialized skills in a formal setting. Nursing offered women the opportunity to professionalize what had previously been an informal voluntary activity. Now, with training schools, examinations, and licenses, female nurses represented a new community of professional women who propelled themselves outside of the domestic sphere and into the workforce. At the same time that women were fighting for the right to vote, nurses and many other women tried to expand women's roles in society. With the onset of the Spanish-American War in 1898, this new community of professional nurses seized the chance to make more inroads into military nursing. The Army, especially, was in desperate need of trained nurses. Men in crowded training camps in the U.S. grew ill, and tropical diseases ravaged the men fighting in Cuba and Puerto Rico, in addition to all of those who were wounded in battle. Enlisted men serving in the hospital corps lacked the training to adequately care for the influx of patients, and a new solution to military medical care was needed. To fill the need for trained nurses, the Surgeon General requested and was granted authority to hire female contract nurses to support the Army. As contract nurses, These women were civilian employees paid by the Army. They were not officially in the military. They were kind of like today's government contractors. Eventually, more than 1,500 women served in this capacity during and after the war. Some of the credit for this opportunity is due to the advocacy and leadership of Anna Caroline Maxwell, buried here at Arlington National Cemetery. A highly trained nurse before the Spanish-American War, she served as the superintendent of several nursing schools and in many other leadership positions. As a leader in this nascent occupation, she and others spoke up to advocate for female nurses to serve with the Army during the Spanish-American War, and she eventually took an assignment at a Georgia field hospital. Here we can see a picture of her at that hospital. I circled her face in red. Although she and her nurses were met with some skepticism from their male colleagues at first, they quickly proved their worth and demonstrated that women could successfully contribute to the mission. Colonel John Van Rensselaer Hoff, who was chief field surgeon at Camp Thomas, Georgia, told Maxwell that, quote, "When you first arrived, we did not know what to do with a contingent of women in the camp. Now, we are wondering what we should have done without you." And here we can see a picture of Anna Caroline Maxwell's grave in section 21, where she rests along with her fellow contract nurses. This takes us now to our next grave, that of Namahyok Nama Curtis. Not all contract nurses who served in the Spanish-American War were treated equally. Just like in the United States at the time, racial segregation left its imprint on the effort to recruit contract nurses. The Daughters of the American Revolution, a hereditary organization that recruited many nurses, prohibited Black women from volunteering. Nonetheless, some Black women were eventually able to serve. The Surgeon General asked Nama Curtis, a prominent Black nurse based in Washington, D.C., to recruit Black women to serve as contract nurses. Of African American and American Indian descent, Curtis recruited 32 Black women as contract nurses, and as many as 80 altogether may have served. Their dedicated service helped slowly pave the way for more women of color to eventually serve as nurses, despite the prejudice that impacted their work in numerous ways. At the time, some Americans believed that Black people were more immune to tropical diseases, which of course is not true, and several of the Black nurses did indeed succumb to typhoid fever. Nonetheless, these women did not let prejudice stop them. They seized the opportunity to serve their nation and demonstrate Black women's ability to administer healthcare in wartime, a major milestone in Black women's continuing struggle for equality. So, talking about Black women and the prejudice they faced, it's really interesting to note that even though Arlington National Cemetery was racially segregated until 1948, Nama Curtis was buried with her fellow nurses in section 21. Let's head now to the grave of Anita H. Campos and talk about how these female nurses are commemorated here at Arlington. Although they were not officially members of the military, they were able to be buried here, and most of their headstones noted that they were contract nurses to differentiate them from actual members of the military, and we can see that here on Nama Curtis's grave. So how, might you ask, were these nurses able to be buried at Arlington if they didn't officially serve in the military? In 1897, Congress passed legislation that allowed Army nurses to be buried in any national cemetery free of cost. My colleague, Kathy Fargy, conducted new research on this legislation, which enabled the burial of Civil War nurses at Arlington based on their own service, not the service of a husband. Many of them are buried in Section 1, and Kathy led a wonderful Women's History Month tour of their graves a few weeks ago in March. This legislation, passed just 1 year before the Spanish-American War, enabled contract nurses from that conflict to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And here we can see a photo of the Civil War nurse Caroline Burghardt and her grave in Section 1. Anita H. Campos, though, was the first Spanish-American War contract nurse buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So now we're back in the nurses section, Section 21. It was a very short walk, folks. It's not a short walk, FYI, if you come to ANC in person. Born in New Jersey, Campos married her Cuban husband in 1880 and lived in Cuba for some time before the war. She died of malaria while serving in Cuba in 1899. Buried not far from the memorial that honored her and other nurses who died in the line of duty, her grave, along with the graves of Civil War nurses, helped inaugurate a new era at Arlington, when women could be buried based on their own service to the nation. That memorial is our next stop, so let's walk there now. And in this photo, you can see how close Anita Campos's grave is to the Spanish-American War Memorial, which is shown on the right with that red arrow. This memorial is the first memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, specifically dedicated to women's military contributions. Over 150 contract nurses died of disease in the line of duty during the Spanish-American War. 140 from typhoid, and 13 from other diseases. This memorial honors them. After the war, the Society of Spanish-American War Nurses began a fundraising campaign to erect a memorial to these deceased nurses at Arlington, here in Section 21, where so many had been buried. Dedicated in 1905, this memorial features the inscription, "To Our Comrades." It memorialized these female nurses as wartime fatalities, just like men who died in combat. And here we can see some close-up images of the details of the memorial. The president of the Society of Spanish-American War Nurses, Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee, played a critical role in the creation of this memorial. She is buried at Arlington in Section 1, which again is rather far from Section 21, but because we're virtual tonight, we don't have to worry about distances. We can just hop on over to visit her grave. Born in Washington, D.C., Dr. McGee graduated from what is now known as George Washington University with a medical degree in 1892. She even gave birth to her first child during her time in the program. She ran her own medical practice for several years before returning to research and focusing on women's issues. She felt strongly that female nurses should be used by the military during the Spanish-American War. As a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, she eventually organized the recruitment of volunteer nurses through that organization. In August of 1898, Brigadier General George Sternberg, the Surgeon General, appointed Dr. McGee as an acting assistant surgeon. After the war, she founded the Society of Spanish-American War Nurses. This memorial represents her dedication to ensuring that her community of nurses would not be forgotten. Her daughter even had the honor of unveiling the memorial on May 2, 1902. This was a memorial for women, created by women, intended to position women's military nursing alongside men's military service as an equal contribution to the nation. This was an especially important visual argument to make at Arlington. At the turn of the century, it became common practice at Arlington to place a memorial dedicated to a specific conflict or group of service members in a section surrounded by their graves. So let's head on back to Section 21 to talk about that. Although it is kind of hard to tell at this time of year because the trees are so beautifully in bloom, from Section 21, you can see the USS Maine Memorial, which stands next to the graves of those who died when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, sparking the Spanish-American War. The tall column that can also be seen in Section 21, in this photo I've marked it for you with the red arrow, is the Spanish-American War Memorial, created by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America, a hereditary organization of women who traced their ancestry back to colonial America. As well, the Spanish-American War Nurses Memorial is not far from the Rough Riders Memorial. The abundance of memorials to the Spanish-American War transformed the landscape at Arlington into a place where that war's memory was honored alongside the Civil War, the formative conflict at the heart of Arlington's origins. In fact, ANC has the most sites related to the Spanish-American War within the continental United States. By choosing to erect a memorial to their lost comrades in the section where these women were buried, the Society of Spanish-American War Nurses visually aligned themselves with the male military service members who served in that war. They made a strong statement that they too had served and were commemorated on the landscape here, in this most sacred of American military cemeteries. Their memorial could easily be seen in a part of the cemetery devoted to the memory of the Spanish-American War. This is really essential to understand as we discuss the significance of these nurses. Their memorial demonstrated how women were making significant inroads into military service through nursing. As indicated by their graves and their memorial, women could no longer be fully sidelined from the military. The military needed these women's skills just as much as the women wanted to serve. After the Army's successful use of contract nurses in the Spanish-American War, Congress passed a bill in 1901 to create the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Dr. McGee drafted much of that bill's text, ensuring that women would have a permanent place in Army nursing as part of the Army, not as civilian contractors. And here we can see the legacy of that bill with Julia Stimson in 1920, who was then chief of the Army Nurse Corps. Through the Army Nurse Corps, women were officially welcomed into the U.S. Armed Forces, a major achievement, and women's long campaign to be fully accepted into society and allowed to serve their country. So let's head now to the Nurses Memorial in Section 21, where we will continue this story and conclude. The creation of the Army Nurse Corps in 1901 was a direct result of successful service of the contract Army nurses who participated in the Spanish-American War. Not long after, in 1908, the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps was established, allowing women to serve as nurses in both major branches of the military. Well, with a caveat. Although these Army and Navy nurses served in the military as service members, they were not officially enlisted, nor were they officially officers, and they held a strange, undefined status without official rank or even full authority over the men in their care. If you're thinking, wait a second, Allison, that does not make sense to you, you're correct, and that was the point. It was a way to curtail women's power and status, even as they were given new opportunities for advancement. However, despite these drawbacks to their position in the military, female nurses did receive veteran status, a key distinction that enabled them to receive veterans' benefits such as military care and still be buried here at Arlington or other national cemeteries. This differentiated them from many women who supported the military in other ways during World War I. For time's sake, the story of military nurses in the First World War is one we will hopefully have to come back to another day. But I do want to talk some about the legacy of World War I nurses and how they marked Section 21 with the Nurses Memorial. This memorial was created to honor the American nurses who died during World War I. While an exact number still remains elusive, historians generally estimate that number to be somewhere above 200 deaths. Most of these fatalities can be attributed to influenza, or complications from it such as pneumonia. While these women did not die on the battlefield and remain barred from equal status in the military, they volunteered to serve during wartime, and they gave their lives for their nation while fighting this pandemic. After the war, just like the contract nurses from 1898, their comrades wanted to honor their sacrifices at Arlington, here, in Section 21, not far from the Spanish-American War Nurses Memorial. While other memorials to the deceased World War I nurses were erected in the U.S., this memorial specifically memorialized the Army and Navy nurses who served within the military itself, albeit with that unequal status I mentioned. Dedicated in 1938, this graceful Art Deco statue depicts a military nurse standing tall in her uniform, cape draped over her shoulders, looking across the section as if she is gazing at the nurses buried below. Designed by female sculptor Frances Rich, this statue is not too unlike the standing doughboy statues popular at the time to memorialize fallen soldiers from World War I. Located here in Arlington, funded by women, and crafted by a woman, this memorial represents women's contributions to World War I. It is an attempt to honor these women in the same manner as men, placing them on the same plane of military sacrifice. In 1971, the memorial was rededicated to commemorate the service of Army, Navy, and Air Force nurses in all conflicts. It stands today as a symbol of their service and sacrifice, a reminder that women also paid and continue to pay the ultimate price for the United States. Through the efforts of the Army Nurse Corps Association, this memorial and the Spanish-American War Nurses Memorial remain active parts of the commemorative narrative at Arlington, ensuring that the memory of these trailblazing women lives on more than a century after their service. The Nurses Memorial and Section 21 overall would not be here without the bold, risk-taking work of the contract nurses who served during the Spanish-American War. These women saw that their nation needed their skills, and they refused to stand idly by. They worked together to carve out a place for women in military medicine, and they opened the door for the later creation of the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. They laid the foundation for future generations of military nurses and enabled many other women to pursue careers in military nursing. During this 160th anniversary of Arlington National Cemetery's creation, I think it's fitting that we recognize these women and commemorate their lasting achievements. Though they might not officially have been in the military, they are military women nonetheless, unofficial veterans who should be recognized as such, no matter what the bureaucracy might say. By looking back at the history of the Spanish-American War contract nurses, I hope that we can all find a deeper meaning in your understanding of the lineage of the Army Nurse Corps. History is not just a bunch of stale facts in a textbook, but valuable lessons that can help us create a better future. This is something that the Army Nurse Corps Association's motto so eloquently recognizes with its mantra of preserving our past, capitalizing on the present, embracing our future. Today's nurses will one day be the historic figures studied by nurses of tomorrow, and your victories will be their tales of inspiration. If you want to learn more about Arlington's upcoming virtual and in-person events, you can follow us on social media at Arlington National and visit our website, arlingtoncemetery.mil. At our education website, shown here, we actually have an entire module about the Spanish-American War with specific materials focused on the contract nurses. These are aimed at students of all ages and lifelong learners, which is basically adults like ourselves. And if you're in or near the DC area, I hope you can come to some of our upcoming in-person events. On May 13th, we will be holding special history talks to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the first military burial here. On Sunday, May 26th, the weekend of Memorial Day, we will again be hosting Flowers of Remembrance Day. On that day, the public is allowed to place a flower at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and our team will be doing a lecture at 10 a.m. and a walking tour at 10:30. If you don't live near DC, don't worry, we have a virtual event coming up for you as well. On June 5th, we will be doing a collaborative webinar with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum about survivors and liberators of concentration camps who were buried at Arlington. And then to cap off our 160th anniversary season, on June 15th, we will be doing a special 160th anniversary tram tour with our horticulture colleagues. I hope to see some of you at these events. Thank you again for the wonderful opportunity to speak tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you, Allison. What a great presentation. Now I know why everybody was so eager to have you be our presenter for this webinar. What a great job you did. We have some questions, so if you're good with it, I'll read them to you and you can answer them. Is that good for you?
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So the first one was, what was the impact of the Daughters of the American Revolution on the selection of nurses?
The Daughters of the American Revolution, they essentially served as an an organization that helped to recruit and hire the contract nurses. So we talked about the women. I think it was Dr. McGee who was really in charge of that. Basically, they were taking on a role that the Army just couldn't handle at the time. So that's why the Daughters of the American Revolution adhered to racial segregation and did not allow Black women to be recruited through their organization. It's very much unlike anything we have today. It's a very different type of recruiting effort. I can't really imagine right now the US government allowing a private organization to be able to recruit nurses, but this was a new frontier. They were trying to figure things out. So basically, it was like they hired the DAR on a voluntary basis to take on this duty for them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Second question, outstanding presentation. I want to know more about Army nurses in Vietnam. Any recommendations for me? I served later.
Oh, thank you so much. My first recommendation would be to go to the website of the Vietnam War 50th Anniversary Commemoration Office. They have a lot of online resources about nurses during the Vietnam War, including these beautiful posters that you can actually print off. They're almost like little mini museum exhibits that you can print that talk about the history of Vietnam War nurses. If you want to actually hear from nurses themselves, the Library of Congress, their Veterans History Project, has a massive database of oral histories of service members from various time periods, and I'm fairly certain that they have a lot of oral histories of Vietnam era nurses on there. I'd also recommend checking out the resources at the Military Women's Memorial Foundation. They have an excellent website, and inside of their building, which is located at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, but they're a separate organization from us, they actually have an exhibit case that talks about Vietnam War era nurses. Hopefully that's enough to get you started.
And I'll just add, as a former board member of the Vietnam Women's Memorial Foundation, we also have a website, and you can look at all of the storytelling that we do every Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and some other information there as well. So thank you, Allison. Linda Mass wants to know if Louisa May Alcott was one of the contract nurses who went to New York.
All right, you've stumped me. I don't know, and I'm ashamed because I love Louisa May Alcott. I love Little Women, anything Little Women, visited the house. So, Linda, you know what I'll be doing on Google for the rest of the night. So thank you. I will check that out. Now I'm really excited. If that did happen, I think it needs to be a movie.
Definitely. Roy Harris, former president of the Army Nurse Corps Association, said, I noticed that contract nurses were called Army nurses outside of burial at Arlington. Did they receive any other veteran benefits after their service? How many of them entered the Army Nurse Corps in 1901? Great presentation.
Oh, thank you, Roy. It gets confusing. On their headstones at Arlington, as we saw, it says contract nurses, but they didn't always identify themselves as contract nurses, and most of the time they were just called Army nurses. It's one of those technicality. So, yes, officially they were contract civilian nurses, but people colloquially called them Army nurses. No, they didn't receive any military or veteran benefits. They were not in the Army, they were not in the military. No medical care, no pension, nothing like that. The one benefit they got, and I'm not even sure benefit is the right term, is the burial eligibility. And that was only because of the law that was passed before the Spanish American War for those Civil War nurses. So, really, those Civil War nurses, it was their advocacy that allowed the Spanish American War contract nurses to be allowed to have burial. And I don't know how many of them entered the Army Nurse Corps in 1901. I haven't seen any statistics on that in my research, but I do know a lot of them did, because if you follow their careers, a lot of them joined the Army Nurse Corps, and many of them actually continued on to serve in World War I.
Linda Siegel says, thank you for the interesting history lesson. I didn't even know about section 21. And I remember when I discovered it, what a great day that was, looking at that statue and all of the graves there. So thank you.
Please come on out. Section 21 is really quite close, actually, to Memorial Amphitheater and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So it's not a hard walk if you come out.
Peggy Combe, who's also a past president of the Army Nurse Corps Association, said, can we get a list of the upcoming events at Arlington that Dr. Finkelstein mentioned at the end of her presentation?
Sure. If you go on our website, arlingtoncemetery.mil, they are all announced there on the homepage on the right. And then if you follow us on social media, you can also get updates about those. And even if you don't have a Facebook account, our account is public, so you can just go to that site and look at it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Cynthia Ingham, sorry, said, I'm curious to know if any Black enslaved women accompanied their owners into the Confederate Army during the Civil War, as did many Black enslaved men.
That's a very interesting question. I have not personally done primary source research on that, so I don't have a good answer for you.
It is an interesting question. Karen Vincent Van Houder, were you in the U.S. Army ever, or just was involved with the nurses since you were the historian at Arlington National Cemetery?
No, I was not in the Army, just a good old Army brat here, and military historian. Again, brought into the world by all of you Army nurses.
Um, Myrna Armstrong said she believes Louisa Alcott participated in the Civil War.
I know her
And
father served.
Linda Mass said Alcott wrote a short story called Hospital Sketches that I think talked about this. Very interesting. Karen Gaussman, our current president of the Army Nurse Corps Association, said, great presentation. I find it interesting that legislation recognized Army nurses with burial rights in National Cemetery. I Googled to find veteran benefits were established in 1917 for men, and Army nurses did not receive benefits until 1945.
Not quite. So once the U.S. Army Nurse Corps was established, those women were considered to officially be in the military, and they did receive veterans benefits. So all of the nurses in World War I and World War II. It wasn't until there was later legislation that adjusted their rank that they were treated equally, meaning they could be an officer or enlisted. It's very complicated. It's kind of illogical, and I think that's really indicative of the challenge of the military when they tried to accept women into the military.
Oh, Mary Kay wants to know about nurses who served in World War I.
One book that I really like is by Julia Irwin. It's called Making the World Safe. It's specifically about the American Red Cross, which played a major role in military nursing for the US during World War I. So I would definitely look at that one. And then there's another one. Let me see if I can get the title up for you. It's by Marion Moser Jones. Um, Hopefully I can find it. You can ask me another question while I find that title.
Okay. The next question is Jane Delano is considered the America's Florence Nightingale. Do you have information about her?
Yes. Yes. Oh, I could do a whole lecture on just Jane Delano. So she's buried in Section 21 of Arlington National Cemetery. And she was truly the main leader of military nurses during World War I. And she actually died in 1919 in France from an infection that most likely was a complication from influenza. She was on duty inspecting the condition of nurses who were still serving in France. When she died, her remains were repatriated to Arlington. There was a very big burial ceremony for her, and she became a real martyr for the Army Nurse Corps. The book I also want to mention is The American Red Cross From Clara Barton to the New Deal by Marion Moser Jones. She talks a lot again about Red Cross nurses who did a lot of the recruiting for the Army Nurse Corps in World War I.
Thank you. Next question. Uh-oh. Now we're asking your personal opinion. What is your favorite grave memorial place at Arlington National Cemetery?
I don't think I'm really supposed to choose favorites, but if you force me, I think one of my favorite sections, it's actually two adjacent sections, section 18 and section 19, which are the World War I sections. In those sections, just by walking through the rows of headstones, you can get a very clear sense of what service members did during World War I. And because one of those sections is segregated, you can actually see written in stone in front of you the impact of racial segregation on the American Expeditionary Forces. And right in that area is the Argonne Cross Memorial, which was meant to honor those who served in World War I and to connect that section of the cemetery to the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
Thank you. Roy Harris says maybe the history of the Army Nurse Corps written by Colonel Mary Sarnecki would have specific info about
Yes.
World War One.
Yeah, that's a resource I definitely use a lot.
And Cynthia Ingham said, those of us who are RAIN, Walter Reed Army Institute of Nursing alumni, lived in Delano Hall at Walter Reed and remember the life-size portrait of Jane Delano.
There you go. Yeah, she's really a towering figure in your history.
Next question is, how large is Arlington National Cemetery?
Over 640 acres, and we're currently undergoing an expansion. So if you drive by the Air Force Memorial and you see a bunch of torn up dirt, that's our next expansion section.
Thank you. What is the most poignant story about nurses that you have uncovered and how did you learn about it?
Hmm. It's hard to choose because as you research these nurses, you get to feel very connected to them. So I'm going to choose a group instead of just one. In the spring of 2020, when we were all enduring those first couple months of COVID, I started doing research remotely on nurses who were buried at Arlington in Section 21 who may have died of influenza during the influenza pandemic. And it took some digging, and I wasn't able to go to the archives, but I was able to locate, I think, 3 or 4 of them. There's a blog article about it on our website, and reading about those women and how they contracted influenza and usually passed away from complications of a secondary infection during the time when we were all in lockdown, and seeing the photos of nurses with masks as we were figuring out how to wear masks, That was very moving to me, and it was a moment when I felt required and compelled to tell those stories because people could finally connect to who those women were.
Yeah. Well, likewise, when you were talking about the nurses statue, I was thinking about the Vietnam Women's Memorial, where it was thought up by a woman, created by a woman, and through the grassroots efforts of not just women, but a lot of women. So it's amazing. History really does repeat itself.
It's a beautiful memorial.
It is gorgeous. Cindy Moen wants to know, would you consider doing another presentation on Jane Delano?
I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll get with the Army Nurse Corps Association board and see when we're going to have that again. And let's see, next question is, what is it like to be a historian working at a national cemetery as compared with holding an academic position at a college or university?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, every day at Arlington is different, and it's very exciting. Um, you can spend one day deep in research and writing, digging through the archives, and the next day, like last week, you're giving an exhibit tour to the Prime Minister of Japan. We have a really wonderful opportunity to share history with the American public. And as much as I love being in a university setting and interacting with undergraduate students, I really find it fulfilling to be able to reach out to different communities, whether it's a high school group from West Virginia or a group of really accomplished Army nurse members like yourselves. It takes a little bit of the selfish focus of scholarship away and creates a focus that's more on sharing research and engaging. And I get to learn a lot from people like you who give me new things to research and questions to look into. So I just really enjoy that. It's a lot less solitary, which is nice.
Um, oh, um, so CJ Moore, who has been an Army Nurse Corps historian, said 202 nurses were charter nurses in 1901. They all had served as contract nurses.
Oh, thank you, CJ. This has been a real pleasure. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and I hope to see some of you out at the cemetery or at a virtual event.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. This time, I would like to ask our current president, Colonel Karen Gaussman, to come on and close us out. And then Allison, if you could just stay on afterwards, we'll do a little AAR. I forgot to mention that when we did our pre-brief. So I'm going to go on mute and turn off my video for now.
Dr. Finkelstein, it's great to see you again and to share Army Nurse Corps history with you. And most importantly, to share it with my colleagues. Your presentation was phenomenal. You gave us a better understanding of, or a broader understanding of those who served during times of war and the impact it has had on all of us. Along with that, your presentation was informative, relative, and quite engaging. I love how your eyes sparkle when you get excited about something. So know that that comes across to all of us, and it is endearing to see your enthusiasm. You are a great storyteller. I knew that when I met you at Arlington Cemetery during the Veterans Day program, and it carried through tonight. Thank you. I appreciate you being here, and I also need to thank, or want to thank, Lenny and Nikki McCaslin and CJ Moore for being engaged in planning this presentation, hosting it, and narrating for us. Phenomenal job, and I thank you for your time. And I'm excited that they would like you to come back and tell us a little bit more about Colonel Delano. So we do have a convention coming up at the end of September. It's going to be in Cary, North Carolina. During that convention, we are going to talk again about Army Nurse Corps history. We have CJ Moore talking with us at that time, but we're going to also touch on all of the aspects of our motto, talking about history, education, research, scholarship, and what we do as an organization to support others. So thank you.